It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. And I'm looking forward to speaking a little bit about the journey from the limits to growth to Earth4All, the latest publication of the Club of Rome, but also would like to leave enough space to discuss together with you and speak about these issues jointly. But so let's start in the year 1972. Most people, when they hear the word the Club of Rome, they think immediately of the book, which was the most famous publication of the Club of Rome, The Limits to Growth, published in 1972 by a team of MIT researchers in the US, funded ironically by the Volkswagen Foundation, by the way. One could also say maybe one of the most misinterpreted books of the 20th century. Dennis Meadows, one of the co-authors, one of the main leads of the project, afterwards, some years ago, said, millions of people thought we were right, millions of people thought we were wrong, and a few people have actually read the book. But the main message of The Limits to Growth you can see here. It says, if the present growth trends in world population, industrialization, pollution, food production, and resource depletion continue unchanged, the limits to growth on this planet will be reached sometime within the next 100 years. The most probable result will be a rather sudden and uncontrollable decline in both population and industrial capacity. The limits to growth was not a prediction. The limits to growth did not say that the oil would run out in the year 2000 or that the world is going to be an apocalyptic one in the year 1990. What the limits to growth did was a scenario analysis. So not predicting this is definitely going to happen, but comparing in 12 different scenarios with 12 different assumptions, which pathways could the world go if the developments of the 70s remain the same. And thereby, as one of the first books, trying to compare in a complex system how different factors interact. So not just look at how does population increase, but also see what does the population increase have to do with the food production, with the pollution, with the industrial output, etc. And all of these things are linked, that you can see a little bit. The method can be described a little bit with this elephant you see at the bottom right. 6 blind men touching different parts of the elephant, and the one touching the skin thinking, oh, this is a tree, and the one touching the ear thinking, oh, this is a carpet. But only by zooming out a little bit and only by comparing all the different parts, you notice that the sum of the whole system is more than the individual parts, and only by taking a perspective of an overview, you notice you can see the whole picture. So that's what the Limits to Growth tried to do, see the whole picture of the future trajectory of mankind for the next 100 years through an analysis of systems that interact with each other. The Limits to Growth met fierce resistance when it was published. In 1970, that was 72 or 3 years after the moon landing, and the model of progress and progress through material means, and we can achieve a better world, and technology is going to save us all. And the reactions to the book were, I would say, mixed. There is this famous quote by Ronald Reagan saying, there are no limits to growth as long as men and women are free to follow their dreams. And you see that there is already a very strong ideological component included in this whole debate. Limits to Growth spoke about basically there's no unlimited material growth on a finite planet. Ronald Reagan says we are free in our thoughts. So that is the difficult dimension. And 50 years later, we can just have a quick look at how accurate that was. So as I said, 12 different scenarios were being built up. Some of them indicated that there would be this rather sudden decline in economic output, population, food production. Some others came to the conclusion that we can actually stabilize our planet and come to an equilibrium where man, women, and nature can live in harmony, as it was said. This is now some pictures from a study from the year, I think, 2014 by Turner, an Australian researcher, trying to compare the business as usual scenario with actual real-world data from that time. And you had different other studies trying to compare 50 years later. Do we follow the trends indicated in the different scenarios, or don't we follow them? The main conclusions by these researchers mostly is that we are closest to what was back then framed as business as usual 2 scenario, which meant business as usual, but with the assumption of double the amount of resources. So they would say, you know, the researchers underestimated the resources available at the Earth, but that's what scenarios are for, right? Taking different assumptions, and they would say that we are very much on track with the negative scenarios. Before we come to the thing what that means, I just want to point out that it was not just Club of Rome and some hippies and green and leftist people saying, oh, we might run into limits and there's an ecological problem coming up. You see here on the left side a study by ExxonMobil, oil company, trying to compare the increase in CO2 with the actual increase in temperature. So you see that, I know it's difficult to see, but you see the red line CO2 increase and the blue one as temperature increase. That's very, very, very accurate. So while the limits to growth did not yet speak about climate change, but rather the finite nature of our planet, there were others, particularly oil companies, also pointing out that this is the trajectory we were on. Not surprisingly, this study was not published and became a little bit more prominent last year. But so to say, there were warning signs, right? You see on the right side from the year 1990, one of the first IPCC suggestions on how to reduce CO2, but the warnings became more and more prominent. So you had limits to growth in 72, you had ExxonMobil 82, and really that it was picked up broadly was only probably in 92 at the Rio conference. But what did we see since then? What was the actual way we went forwards to? It's a graph you can describe through the great acceleration. And the great acceleration basically shows an increase of our material consumption, of our production in basically all imaginable areas. You see on the left side factors such as world population, real GDP, paper production, water use. All of that is a constant increase since the 1970s. And you see on the right side that the same is true for gases such as methane, for CO2. And both of that relate to the limits to growth in the sense that limits to growth warned that there is a limit to our material consumption, both in the way we use resources, because resources are finite and at some point we can't just continue to grow, but also that we at some point might overshoot the carrying capacity of the planet, so that it will be difficult for the atmosphere to take up all the gases, for the oceans to take up all the gases, and this constitutes another limit to how we can grow in material terms. So maybe just at the beginning to say limits to growth was always about real material, gases, resources, etc., not so much about the monetary dimension, to which we can come later. This is just a different representation, and to say that this is where we were in 72. So it was actually at the very beginning of this growth paradigm. And when you listen to the presentations and speeches of the researchers back then, they were not that pessimistic. They were not like, oh, the apocalypse is coming right away. They were rather arguing that, look, we show you that we run into a crisis, but the world has all potential to change now, so let's do that. It was not a negative doomsday scenario. It was very often connected with a message of, oh, changing is not so difficult. Actually, it would not have been. In 72, the kind of graphs of reduction we would have had to see were not as drastic. But basically, as we see that this growth just continued, it is much more difficult today. The kind of reducing our material consumption is much more difficult today than it was 50 years ago. And we see today the consequences that we did not see 50 years ago. Today, we often, or mostly, when we speak about our environmental problems, speak about climate change. That you see on the right side, you see the temperature development since the late 19th century, and how it is constantly increasing. So you see in the inner circle, that's the outer circle is the 1 degree. In Paris, we said, you know, ideally 1.5 degrees. We should not overshoot, but definitely under 2 degrees. But you see now, compared to 50 years ago, the consequences of these temperature rises. You see that food production in certain countries is difficult. You see that certain areas will become inhabitable. You see that also social problems are coming along with it, such as climate refugees. All of that was not clear 50 years ago, but it is clear very much today. Interestingly, though, I mean, the climate dimension is just one of many others we need to look at. At the left side, you see what is probably today the best conceptualization of these planetary boundaries of what the limits to growth warrant of overshooting, which is this concept developed by Jon Rockström, Will Steffens, identifying different planetary boundaries we have that we can't overshoot. So we can't overshoot the CO2 for climate change. We can't overshoot our issues in the context of biodiversity. We need to be careful in pollution and ocean acidification, etc. And what they try to do through this concept and the quantification is to define a safe operating space for humanity. So basically what our consumption patterns in our economic systems, where we can have a good life in a regenerative way, where we don't overshoot. And what we see now is that 6 out of these 9 defined planetary boundaries are being overshot. So that is a lot of data at the beginning, so I thought in the meantime a quick comic sometimes helps. You see here Bart Simpson saying this is the hottest summer of your life, Bart Simpson saying this is the coldest summer for the rest of your life. So be pleased, and on the right side you see a little bit the problem exemplified on our biodiversity loss. But these are two of the main issues we see in the environmental front. Climate change, biodiversity loss becoming more and more accurate, and much more crucial as 50 years ago, as we have seen. But the important thing is, and the important thing that leads to the publication of Earth4All, is that we can't decouple the environmental dimension from a social dimension. We know that it's not true to say, oh, we as humans, we are all sitting in the same boat. We are all equally responsible for the climate catastrophe. We all have the same impact on the world. What you see on the left side is this champagne glass graphic, where you see that the 10% richest people in the world are responsible for 50% of CO2 emissions worldwide. So there is a close correlation of income with the emissions we have. And on the right side, you see a comparison of the material footprint between the years 1990 and the year 2017. And do not only see that, of course, people with higher income have a higher material footprint, because, you know, there's more travel, there's more cars, there's more houses, there's more meat consumption, etc. But that you even see that the footprint of the poorest people, of low-income people, is actually in many regions going down since years, decades. It is already the case that there is a certain decoupling in low-income for low-income people of the effect of their consumption and environmental impact. But that you see that this is absolutely not the case if you look at the high-income groups, because there is an overconsumption taking place that overcompensates the reduction taking place at the low-income groups. So today I read an article saying that if the richest top percent or the top 10% emitters in the world would reduce their carbon footprint to the average of the European, which is not the worst, we could reduce our carbon output by already 1/3. So that is how strong the effect is. And that is how strong it is then to include the social dimension, why inequality does not only matter in monetary terms, but also in this carbon dimension. We need to speak, if we speak about climate change, also speak about inequality. And interestingly, just as one part, this is not only true on a global level, but you see here the different regions from East Asia to Europe, North America, South America, and see in every region that it is the top 10%, and if you even go higher in the ladder, the top 1%, kind of responsible for most of the climate issues and the responsibility there, which is, you know, it's not an individual issue, it's a systemic issue, but I think it's an important thought we must have in mind when we later speak about the fact who is going to pay for the transformation we will have to see. So there are a lot of kind of dimensions of inequality here. And before I finally come to Earth4All, one other one is, of course, that we see that in individual income groups, people who have more money consume more and therefore have a higher footprint. But that we also see very often that while rich countries, high-income countries are responsible for most of the historic CO2 emissions in the world, the consequences very often now are more severe in low-income countries. And that is a dilemma on a global level, which does justify, or which does make necessary, that we need to speak about transfers from rich countries to poor countries, because we, as high-income countries, did put other countries in a situation where they have more floods, where they will have to deal with more extreme weather events, where the food production is going to be more difficult, and where migration waves are going to come. And if that kind of feedback loop will also affect high-income countries in the end. So I think that this inequality between high-income and low-income countries does definitely justify transfers, and we will speak about that later. One last dimension I just want to quickly point out is that one could say, okay, we are, destroying our ecological foundation of our world, and we're have a big issue with inequality, and we have difficulties with our climate in the near future, and all of that. But at least we see that people are doing better, and I think that is one of the wrong promises of our economic system currently. It's not the case anymore that well-being of people, as perceived as their happiness, is increasing in high-income countries, but people now, actually, it's the first time we see through empirical studies across Europe that parents say that they think their children are going to have a worse life than them. So I think that this model of progress, where you kind of base your hope on material growth for a better world, which worked out in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that is no longer holding. What we actually see now in high-income countries is increasing rates of burnouts, increasing rates of people feeling stressed, increasing rates of depressions. And I think that it's important to connect that the economic system, as we currently set it up, is destroying the environment, is responsible for increasing inequality, but does at the same time not even help to increase the well-being of the majority. And that basically is the foundation for the latest report to the Club of Rome. 50 years after the limits to growth, we thought that it would be good to bring different people together to work also on what happens in the last 50 years, but also give a trajectory of the future, not as a prediction, but to say what are potential solutions that we could take now. So it was, less analytic. It was analytic, but less descriptive in a way of just describing what's going on, but combining the description of the challenges that I have pointed out and that we see today with actual solutions that are possible and feasible to implement, and that are a realistic scenario to achieve something like well-being for all on a finite planet. And this Earth4All project was split in 3 different dimensions, one could say. The one is a system dynamic model, which, research is being done here and that too. But the idea is really to connect different factors, show the complexity of systems, and in that case, other than the model used in the limits to growth, not only look at kind of material factors and real economic factors, but also social factors. So to kind of see through quantification what does increasing well-being mean for people, and what does decreasing well-being mean. At the same time, we know this saying, I think George Brock's saying, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And in that sense, we follow that, and I would add that models are always useful for different purposes, right? There's not one model explaining the world, and we need to be careful in pretending objectivity over models, and that we just put some data in a computer, and then the computer tells us the outcome, and then we know what to do. That will never be the case, because models live of the assumptions you put into the models and the interpretation you take out of the models. And in that sense, we thought it was important to put together what we call Transformational Economics Commission, with 30 economic thinkers from across the globe. You might know from Europe, Kate Raworth, or Tim Jackson, or Ernst von Weizsäcker, or Maya Goepel, or Enrico Giovannini in Italy, but also particularly people from other areas in the world. So we had a great development economist, Jayati Ghosh, based in India. We had Eduardo Gudinas, who has developed the concept of buen vivir in Ecuador some years ago and brought it to the Constitution. So the idea was really to bring together a very broad spectrum of people and bridge a little bit this conflict that even is intrinsic to the environmental economic scene, I would say. There are very often people fight themselves more than going towards a common goal. And our idea was to try to bring this together as much as possible. So we had the model, we had the commission and the people we worked with, And we had a global engagement and campaign element embedded to that. Because what we saw with the limits to growth was a book was being thrown out and basically misinterpreted for 40 years. And the goal here was to not make that happen again, but include elements of bottom-up mechanisms, such as citizen assemblies. We now will publish a global survey in April on attitudes towards economic system change in 21 countries. We are engaged in now national engagements to try to bring this Earth4All narrative to national dimensions. And all of that is important, and all of these parts are closely interacted, and I think we need to see that science alone won't solve the world, right? We could also say that science shows that people showing science doesn't work. It does not help if you just look at graphs. I shall present these things, but there is an active element of engagement, people discussing together what are solutions in this region, in the city, in this country, and not having that as a top-down approach. And so these elements we're trying to put together. That is the result of the book published last year, now out in 10 languages, 9, anyways, quite some languages, and kind of being the starting point for a broader engagement across the world. And what we did in Earth4All this time was not compare 12 scenarios, because apparently that didn't work 50 years ago, because people just focused on apocalypse and doomsday, but instead just pick up 2 scenarios, and 2 scenarios with very distinctive titles. One scenario is too little, too late. That scenario is basically following our current trend, what we are doing at the moment, where does the world go there. And in that sense, we see that we will overshoot the 2 degrees goal set in the Paris Accord, but we don't only see the environmental issues, we will see increasing inequality both within and between countries. And we will see especially what we defined as social tension increasing in societies, and I will come back to that later. On the other hand, there was a scenario which we described as giant leap. And the giant leap scenario tries to paint a future that is positive, that does not avoid all consequences of climate change as they are already unfolding. It's too late for that. We will see an increase in extreme weather events, even if we stop consuming CO2 right now. We will see certain consequences, but we would be able to make societies more resilient to deal with these. We would be able to stay below 2 degrees warming in the world, and we would be able to deal with the social factors I mentioned, particularly inequality as well. And so what does it take to take the giant leap? And I think there, what we wanted to do is combine the vision of well-being for all on a finite planet, which is, sounds great and probably everyone could agree, but it's also a little bit fluffy, with very concrete policy actions, concrete goals, and concrete potentials to work on. And again, the important part is the connection between the social and environmental one. And these 5 turnarounds, as we describe them, are the energy turnaround, which is the one we mostly speak about, right? Reduction of CO2 is particularly happening through the energy sector. The other big material one, and the important one, is the food production, because we know that the food system today, as it is one of the biggest problems rather than a solution to both the climate challenge as well as biodiversity loss and degradation of the land. So these are the probably 2 crucial environmental factors we need to attack. We need to make economic systems that make food systems regenerative, so rather than food at the moment emitting CO2, rather making them a sink of CO2. And we need to basically, in the energy sector, get rid of all fossil fuel and reduce energy wherever possible. And we come to that in a little bit more detail. But the environmental factors are not enough. If you just focus on, let's say, the food turnaround, and you, for example, as many liberal economists would say, just include a CO2 tax, and and then the things we don't want get expensive, and the things we want get cheaper, and then the market solves it by equilibrium, you will run into problems where people who already have a higher, with low income, who have a higher consumption rate for food, will be the ones suffering most. You would have a situation where the ones that benefited most from the economic system, in the sense of getting most income and wealth in the last years, would not really notice the difference that much, but poor people would notice it very much. If energy becomes more expensive, then it is particularly those who have a higher percentage of their income they spend for energy who will suffer under that. And we see what happens if we try to take this approach. We see that there will be people on the street. We see that people who feel like something is being taken away from me will be the ones demonstrating and protesting. And that will not only lead to usually populist parties, and I'm originally from Germany and very worried about what's going on there. But it will also, in the end, mean that we won't be able to meet our climate goals, because these right-wing parties making a lot of promises that are usually bad for the majority, but also in the sense of the environmental dimension. So that is why the other factors we have included is one, inequality, with kind of making sure that there is a more equal distribution of the income. Another one being poverty reduction. We have seen huge success in poverty reduction in the last decades, but we still have 4 billion people today living off less than $4 a day. That is something a rich world, and the world we describe as wealthy, wealth has increased massively in the last time, can't happen. And by the way, if then people speak about like, oh yeah, but it's particularly the, you know, alleviating people from poverty that is increasing the CO2 emissions, because then they can also afford to fly. That is not true. I mean, if we know that if we get all people in the world out of absolute poverty, that would increase the CO2 in the world by maybe 1.2%, because as we have already seen before, the massive increase in the CO2 is the overconsumption of the rich. And last but not least, the empowerment turnaround. And empowerment is interesting in various dimensions, because on the one hand, of course, in the 21st century and in a time where we speak about equal rights for everyone, there should not be any discrimination, both in terms of obvious discrimination, such as women could not go to school or should not work or should do this or that job, but also in the sense of subtle discrimination, which is more the case in countries like Germany or Switzerland, such as gender pay gap, right? I mean, that women get less for the same work than men is not justifiable. So there is a normative element and there is a justice element to this empowerment turnaround. But then again, there's also an element to that which relates to the population. You might have seen that at the beginning, Limits to Growth spoke much more about the population increase in the world, which would become a problem because, you know, more people consume more and then we run into planetary boundaries faster. That argument has always been a little bit misleading, first of all, because we have seen that it is people in the rich world that have the high material footprint and not the 6-children family in a very low income countries that is contributing most to climate change. So I think it's always important, because otherwise there is a tendency of also bringing on slightly or not slightly racist stereotypes, such as just send condoms to Africa and the climate problem is going to be solved, what people tend to suggest at such events. So that is, of course, not the case, but we know that empowerment does lead to lower population increases in the world. So we know that by building up good education systems, by building up good social systems, by building up healthcare systems, and particularly empower women to follow their careers, their path, their education. That is a normative argument, but it also shows that it reduces the birth rate in these countries. And we know that the responsibility, as we said, is particularly high emitters in high income countries. But of course, it's different if in the world we have 11 billion people living or 4 billion people living. And according to us, and according to another study, global population could peak at around 9 or 10 billion. But we see that population, it will peak at some point. The question is if in 50 years, 60 years, or 80 years. The UN probably would currently would say that it peaks at 11 billion in the year 2100. But we know that we have influence over that through co-beneficial effects, through implementing education and good systems where people benefit from anyways. We will also be able to make sure that population doesn't become a huge problem. That is, again, I said, we want to combine the narrative and the general outlook and the vision with very, very concrete policies. And those you see here, and no worries, I won't go through them in detail. We can happy to have that in the discussion, or you read the book. Just to say that all of these policies are kind of examples and attempts on a global level to say what could be done. You know, you have, of course, in the inequality turnaround, we need to speak about higher taxation. In the poverty turnaround, come to that, we speak about changes of the international financial system. In empowerment turnaround, we need to speak about education, and energy turnaround, we need to speak both about energy efficiency and reduction of energy consumption, as well as what can be framed as electrifying everything. What I heard today started in Switzerland already in '82, which is of course great. And I will just go through some very briefly to leave enough time for the discussion. But just so that you get a glimpse of the narrative in the book and what we argue about. So poverty, and these are now quotes from the book, we say that crucially there is an urgent need to remove the constraints on low and middle income countries to tackle the dual challenges of climate change and poverty. Without urgent action, it is exceedingly difficult for them to prosper economically and simultaneously reduce carbon emissions or adopt green technology. So, you know, it's not reducing poverty in the world. It's not about sending a little bit more development aid to certain countries. It's not about building another a fountain there. But it is about tackling an economic global system where many institutions at the moment work rather in the favor of rich countries than poor countries. We see that at the moment more than 40 countries pay more money to repayment of debt, particularly to high-income countries or lenders in these countries, than they pay on climate change issues. So more money goes to payment of debt than can be invested into the future. So one of the calls, for example, is a debt cancellation, especially in the phase where we have seen that through COVID, where you know, Fed and ECB and central banks increased their interest rates. That's was discussed as a big problem for our countries in Europe, but it's actually a bigger problem for countries in the global south who are indebted in foreign currency. If then the interest rates increase, then they have to pay more back, which is not feasible for many, and particularly pushing them into a trade-off of either dealing with poverty reduction or climate change adaptation. So that model is really about reforms. There are different suggestions. There's this expanding policy space to debt relief. There are ways at the particularly International Monetary Fund, such as called special drawing rights, where you can provide more finances. But basically, there needs to be a transfer of money from rich countries to poor countries, and there needs to be an international system that that provides the resources for the transformation necessary in those countries. What we see then in the model, if you know, you always see here the blue one, the giant leap, and the pink one, the too little too late, and you see that you would reduce extreme poverty basically one generation earlier. Inequality. I spoke about that already. Inequality has different dimensions. There is a monetary dimension, there is a carbon inequality dimension, but there is also one crucial dimension which refers to the trust and social cohesion of societies. I think if we now speak about increasing populism in the world and increasing destabilization of societies, we also need to speak about increasing inequality. And another quote here is that countries that are more equal perform better in all areas of human well-being and achievement than countries with divisive levels of income inequality. More equal countries tend to have better outcomes when it comes to trust, education, social mobility, longevity, health, obesity, child mortality, mental health, crime, homicides, and so on. Counterintuitively, even wealthy people in more equal societies, for example the Nordic countries, have higher levels of well-being than wealthy people in countries with higher inequality, such as the United States, Brazil, or South Africa, which is obvious. You know, if you're rich in a poor country and build yourself a nice castle in a gated community, you have a worse life than being integrated into a normal society. But the trend of increasing inequality, one can argue, is one of the contributors to the current wave of populism we see in the world. You can see that empirically. You can see that, you know, increasing inequality at the same time in the US led to decrease to trust on the government level. And you could say now, oh yeah, but states are a little bit weird anyways, and it's an exception. but you actually see that throughout throughout the world. The higher if a state is more active in the sense of taking care of basic services for their population, such as healthcare systems, such as education systems, etc., there's higher trust in those governments. And if you see that this trust is eroding, people tend to vote more for populist parties. And I think we can see that now. I think in Germany, for example, you know, you see if there is a feeling of the local swimming pool being closed, of waiting 3 hours at the doctor because there is not enough personnel, of trains, and I take a lot of trains from Germany to Switzerland, always being late until you come to the Swiss border and then it works again. Then this reduces the trust in governments and thereby increases populism. So inequality is a crucial factor in all of that, and that's why some people also, you know, one person, Jürgen Renders, who already wrote on the limits to growth 50 years ago, now co-author of this report as well, would say that his biggest fear is not environmental collapse, but social collapse because of increasing popularization. So here, inequality would limit that. Empowerment, I briefly spoke about, but there's also an element besides the normative one and the population one, that, as we say, improving women's access to education, economic opportunities, and dignified jobs, and all life's chances that these bring will build better, stronger, resilient societies. It will also determine the future trajectory for humanity and our planet this century. We have interesting research there, right? How, for example, if women are involved in peace negotiations, that these peace agreements are longer lasting than if only men are involved. And we see that this resilience argument plays out through different levels there. And of course, empowerment is then also crucially connected to the other turnarounds, as we will see. The food turnaround, I think it's an interesting one, especially at the moment, because we see that, you know, since 1970, the number of people starving has decreased dramatically, particularly through increases in China, one has to say, but it is still remarkable. The population has doubled, and the number of people starving has been reduced. So that is great, but at the same time, the way we produce our food at the moment is more harmful to our planetary boundaries than anything else. I mean, we speak about fossil fuel systems, but the food system is very often a little bit the not so much discussed little brother or sister of a system that that is not only based on, you know, very often based on fossil fuels. And if you speak we have this debate about diesel subsidies, for example, at the moment in Germany. But also there are other problems going beyond emissions, such as deforestation, right? I mean, we had these discussions in Brazil about the cutting off the Amazon under Bolsonaro. And I would just point out that it is, again, important to see that people in Brazil don't just cut off the Amazon for themselves. But very often it's for food production on international market, from which we benefit from as well. So we see that still 10% of people in the world are still facing massive, you know, too little food. While at the same time 2 billion people are basically facing obesity. You know, you have a massive problem of bad food in high-income countries as well. All of that is connected, obviously, too. And so the food turnaround is not only one environmental factor, but also related to the well-being. What we say here in the book is that the way we farm, transport, and consume food affects more planetary boundaries than anything else. The agricultural sector is one of the biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions. It is the largest driver of deforestation and biodiversity loss. By far the world's largest sector consuming fresh water, and excess fertilizers leak into air and streams, lakes, and oceans, causing vast dead zones and even more global warming. So we need to keep that in mind when we speak now about the farmers' protests, and when we speak about the changing of the agricultural system. It should be undebatable that there needs to be a change. The way it is being done, and you know, and I think there were problems in communication and in short-term things that should have done 30 years ago. But agriculture needs to become regenerative by design. There is a consumer element for it, which relates to, for example, meat consumption, but there's also a structural element where farmers will have to change the way they farm. Different solutions to that, as you see in the first graphic, like one relates to food waste. You know, at the moment we waste 1/3 of our food we throw away, but the food sector is probably really one of the elements where we mostly see how we as humans in the Anthropocene have domesticated the world and made it ours. If you look, for example, at the weight of all living species on the earth, of humans, of birds, of flies, of whatever, at the moment the weight of humans and domesticated animals makes 96% of that weight. So the mass of all living creatures outside of human domestication is like 4%. And I think that shows already the vast impact of human behavior there, and particularly in this food space. So that is that turnaround, and the last one before slowly coming to an end, very slowly, is the energy turnaround. But I think we can don't have to go too much into detail, because I think that's the one that is mostly discussed already, right? It's probably one of the most crucial ones, particularly in high-income countries. Energy consumption and fossil fuel systems are often responsible for like 70–80% of CO2 emissions in high-income countries, and we need not only to speak about electrification of everything, but also about reducing energy wherever possible. That means, for example, that it's not a smart idea to try to replace all current combustion engine cars through electric vehicles, right? In big cities, we need to have public transport systems that make it unnecessary for people to need a car. Again, all the perspectives we speak about, always what we do is always from a systemic perspective. It's not a blaming the individual, you have a car perspective. I think that debate is boring. I think it's about the structural elements of societies that need to be put in place in order to be able to achieve this transformation. What we say in this book is that anything that once needed fossil fuels to be burned needs to go. Gone are belching power stations, noisy polluting internal combustion engines, and inefficient boilers and heaters. In their place come roofs and fields of solar power and twirling, clean wind turbines, electric vehicles, and mass transportation system, and energy storage solutions that are ranged from batteries to pumped hydro, which uses renewable energy to pump water into the reservoirs to ensure ample backup energy, etc. I mean, that is something the debate is ongoing in Switzerland, of course, very much. But as we say at the end, we not only need electric vehicles, we need smaller vehicles and fewer vehicles on the road. We have very, very often, particularly in the energy field, seen an effect that energy efficiency gains were eaten up or overcompensated by just making the cars bigger and stronger and heavier, right? I mean, if we use the same weight of cars than in the 70s, but electrified them, the energy consumption of them would be much lower. By trying to overcompensate that, and have now huge SUVs, electric cars, this effect is being overcompensated, and we still use a huge amount of energy for that. So I think when we speak about energy transformation, it does make sense to speak both about efficiency, but also sufficiency, meaning decreasing the consumption wherever possible on a systemic level, as well as an individual one. But what we need to see that this crisis won't be solved through individual action alone. There are then crucial questions, but I think we don't have to go too much into detail of that now. If I can maybe share the slides if anyone wants them, and if you want to have a look at that. But there are fierce arguments going on about can we actually decouple our energy systems from the increases of the economy expressed as GDP. But I think that's a little bit too detailed now, not that relevant. And I think a lot of the things I said, is a little bit like we see the big challenge and we see some potential solutions, but it also seems a little bit far away. It seems a little bit like, oh, it's difficult to implement. So maybe in between one graph I find quite hopeful, showing how quick changes can happen in the world. That is a graph that shows the historical adoption of certain technologies or infrastructure or energy in the past. We see that, you know, in the late 1980s, very slowly there was an increase towards canals, and that then rapidly increased at a certain point. Same for railways or telegraphs or oil pipelines. So I think what we have to see is that change can happen very rapidly, and we might be at a brink for that for renewable energy, but something to discuss later as well. Just to say that with the current trajectory we are on, we would not be able to achieve the what we call net zero, but rather still overshoot in the year in the next decades to come, whereas the transformation of the energy sector would be able to reduce CO2 forms. How do we do that? I think one important factor we argue in the book is that this does not happen out of the blue, and this does not happen through free market logics alone. We know that all of these turnarounds, as we see them here, are connected to an economic system. It's not something that are separated to each other, but it is something that relates to the way we have set up our system of economic endeavor. We know for different reasons that these transformations will not happen by individual action or by free market dynamics alone, but that we will need certain government measures such as subsidies, incentives, or regulations to steer the transformation. One easy explanation for that is that what needs to be done at the moment is not as profitable from an investor's point of view as just continuing business as usual. We see in the energy sector that still huge sums are being invested in fossil fuels around the world. Of course, because our system is based on profit, on increasing profit, right? And that does not change if we leave this narrative to, oh yeah, CO2 prices or whatever will just change that and bring us to a new world. So we see that there are different settings we do have to change that are very feasible to change. Increasing state subsidies on renewable energies, making sure that there are strong regulations on the farming industry and the food systems, reforming international systems so that they benefit more and more money flows to low-income countries, something that is absolutely feasible. One point to point out at the end is that we have to see in which direction do we want to go. I think that what sounds now sometimes technical, or it's not about preventing apocalypse. It's not about, oh, we just do that and then we can save the worst harm that goes to society. But it's actually that we need to think about where do we want to go to have a better life for people in the future. And in that sense, I just want to say that growth in itself, as we have seen at the very beginning, is not a good goal. We see that even the inventor of the indicator of GDP, the Simon Kuznets, said in 1934, the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income as defined by GDP. That was the intention of the founder of GDP, was not to use GDP as a measurement for progress. Robert Kennedy in 1968 said GDP measures everything except that which is worthwhile. So we should not think about increasing GDP as increasing the well-being of people. Rather, we should see that all these transformations, the goal is to achieve a better life. And I want to end with a quote by actually the person who was mostly responsible for writing The Limits to Growth, but was kicked off the cover of the first edition of the German version of The Limits to Growth because the publisher said that with a woman on it, it wouldn't sell as well. And that's why I think it's important to point her out. Donella Meadows, actually responsible for the main narrative, and to show it's not about only material constraints, but it's also about the way we want to live. Donella said, people don't need enormous cars, they need respect. They don't need closets full of clothes, they need to feel attractive, and they need excitement, variety, and beauty. People need identity, community, challenge, acknowledgement, love, joy. To try to feel these needs with material things is to set up an unquenchable appetite for false solutions to real and never satisfied problems. The resulting psychological emptiness is one of the major forces behind the desire for material growth. A society that can admit and articulate its non-material needs and find non-material ways to satisfy them would require much lower material and energy throughputs and would provide much higher levels of human fulfillment. Thank you very much.